What's going on, everyone? It's Adrian from Draft Time, and we're back with another picks video. Now, in this video, I'm going to go over the NFL Week 2 main FanDuel slate. Now, FanDuel actually has a big $2.25 million tournament going on, but I'm not crazy about the payout structure for that one. They got $1 million going to first place, so almost half of the prize pool goes to first place. But they did give me a bunch of free entries into that one, and I also entered a few on my own, so I'll still be participating, but I'm not crazy about that one. But they also got a $3 tournament with $500,000 in prizes and 50,000 going to first place. So only 10% of the prize pool goes to first place. I like that payout structure a lot better. And they're also guaranteeing overlay for this tournament, which if you do the math, it makes sense. It's 150,000 entries at $3 a pop. So that means they're collecting 450,000 in entry fees, and then they're paying out $500,000. So nice little overlay there. So I'm basically going to structure this video like I did last week's. I'm going to go position by position, and then I'm going to show you guys some of the strategies and some of the stacks that I'll be implementing towards the end of the video, as well as the top lineup I'll show you at the end of the video. So for week one, I actually ended up doubling up, but I had some pretty good calls in my week one video. I brought up how I like Josh Allen, his matchup, but I wasn't crazy about stacking him with anyone because he could get you 2 rushing touchdowns, which is exactly what ended up happening. I said I like Jaden Daniels as a sleeper pick, and we had him at 6.2% ownership, and he ended up being 6.4% owned. So we were pretty spot on there. Then I said I like Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans, and then Baker Mayfield and Chris Godwin, and they ended up going off. And I also said I like Tua and Tyreek. And the point is not to give myself credit, but it's to encourage you guys to continue watching these videos because, I don't get every call right, but I provide pretty valuable information in these videos. And while you're at it, shoot this video a like and give us a follow. Also, feel free to comment on the video because your comments help with the algorithm. So would love to see if you guys have any comments about any of these picks that I'm making. Also, make sure you head over to drafttime.com and sign up for a 7-day trial. That way you can have access to all the tools that I'm going to be using in this video. And also make sure you do it soon because I'm going to be closing out the 7-day trial pretty soon. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the slate. Let me filter for quarterbacks and let's take a look at the quarterbacks. And right off the rip, you see Pat Mahomes going up against the Bengals at home. Bengals are ranked 19th against opposing quarterbacks, so below average. Pretty good matchup there. You got Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy, and they might end up being pretty good players. And if they do, then you might be seeing, Pat Mahomes turn into that monster fantasy quarterback that he used to be. But until then, I had to see it before I believe it. But we still got him pretty high, 22.79. But there's some other lower price options that I'd be much more comfortable with in this particular slate. Then you got Lamar Jackson coming off a huge game, but I'm not really crazy about him this week. I think he's got huge downside risk. He's going up against a decent Raiders defense at Max Crosby. He got you 122 rushing yards last game, which means he got the 100-yard rushing bonus. And even though he gets a lot of rushing yards, a lot of rushing touchdowns, you look back at last year and he only had one game where he rushed over 100 yards. So I don't expect him to get that 3-point bonus for that, that much this season. And if you look at his 300-yard games, he only got you that 3 times last season. So, Lamar Jackson's not someone who's going to get you 300-plus yards, 10 times this season. It's just not going to happen. So I just wanted to go over those guys, Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, because they're the top guys on the slate. But guys that I actually like for this particular slate with pretty good value, I like C.J. Stroud. He's one of those guys who I think is capable of throwing for 300-plus yards, 10-plus times this season with all those weapons over there in Houston. Last week, it ended up being Joe Mixon who put up all those points. But I expect this to be C.J. Stroud's offense, not Joe Mixon's. So I expect him to have and he still had a pretty good game last game. He had like 18 fantasy points. So he didn't have a horrible game. But I expect this to be his offense. And I like his matchup against Chicago. Chicago, middle of the road defensively, but at home, I think he's going to have a pretty good game. You got Kyler Murray going against the Rams, who ranked 25th against opposing quarterbacks. I like that matchup for him, $8,000. So he's not too expensive. So I'm going to throw in some Kyler Murray. Another guy I like, Jared Goff, going against Tampa, who's ranked 26th against opposing quarterbacks. You see what Jaden Daniels, the rookie, did to Tampa last week. Had a pretty big game. So I like that matchup for Jared Goff, under $8,000. Also like Matt Stafford going against Arizona. And we see what Josh Allen did to Arizona last week. Arizona, really bad against opposing quarterbacks. $7,500 is a pretty good price for Matt Stafford. And another guy I like Baker Mayfield again. I like him against Detroit, ranked 29th against opposing quarterbacks. I know that defense is really good with Aiden Hutchinson, but they do give up a lot of fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. And Baker's coming in at $7,400. That's a really good price for him. Now, if you want to go sleeper pick, I'm loving Daniel Jones against Washington as a sleeper pick. Okay, Washington is dead last against opposing quarterbacks. You got Daniel Jones. They want his head right now in New York. They hate him. He's under $7,000. $6,900 is very, very cheap for someone going against the worst defense. So I kind of have him as a sleeper pick, but I don't know. Maybe some other people are going to have, they might have the same mentality as me. And I actually got him at 8.72% ownership. So he's not going to be super low owned, but For these 13-game NFL slates, ownership isn't as important as it is for some of the smaller slates. What's more important in these slates is correlation and finding players that are positively correlated, avoiding negatively correlated players. That's a lot more important. Now, another sleeper pick, if you believe in him, I don't particularly believe in him. I think he's going through some stuff right now. Deshaun Watson going up against Jacksonville, ranked 28th against opposing quarterbacks. It's a really good matchup for him. He's $7,100, which is a pretty good price. Deshaun Watson historically has been a good fantasy quarterback, but that's not the case recently. But I don't know. I'm not crazy about Deshaun Watson. He's over here on Twitter with a burner account defending himself. What's it? Leroy Biggerstaff. So, I'm not crazy about Deshaun Watson. I think he's going through some stuff right now. So, I'm not going crazy with any Deshaun Watson sleeper picks. But let's go ahead and take a look at running backs now. So for running backs, there's some really good value plays this week. Brees Hall is not one of them. I mean, we got him at 19.47, and he's the top projected fantasy running back for the week. And with no Christian McCaffrey, it's really looking like Brees Hall is going to be the number one fantasy running back, if I had to guess. He's one of those guys that gets you rushing yards and receiving yards. And even though he had a bad game last week with a really bad matchup, which he has another bad matchup this week, but he still ended up with 15.8 fantasy points when, they had a really bad game. I expect Aaron Rodgers and that offense to do a little bit better this week. But you got Brees Hall. He is someone that you might want to consider fading because I think the optimizer picks him up just because of his price and his matchup. Yeah, you see the optimizer picks him up. But like I was saying earlier, there's some other really good matchups. You got Kyron Williams at $8,000, still pretty expensive, but he's going against the Cardinals, who are awful against opposing running backs. So he's a guy I like. Jordan Mason, obviously, everyone's going to be all over him at $5,500, filling in for McCaffrey. I don't need to say much more about that. Is he someone that you consider fading? Maybe in a couple of lineups, but I'm going all in on Jordan Mason because $5,500 is a really good price. But there's some other guys I like too. I like Josh Jacobs going against the Colts, ranked 30th against opposing running backs. Josh Jacobs did get a lot of usage last week. He had 16 carries for 84 yards, no touchdowns, but I still like his usage that he's getting in the touches that he's getting. Ramondre Stevenson going up against the Seahawks, ranked 27th. Pretty good matchup there. He had a big week last week, under $7,000. He's still someone that you might want to target. And then another guy I like, Najee Harris, going up against the Broncos, who are dead last against opposing running backs. Had 20 carries last week, Najee did. So he's getting a lot of touches. Only $6,600. That's a pretty good price for him. So he's someone I like. J.K. Dobbins had a pretty good week one, finished with 21.4 fantasy points. That's a good matchup. So there's a lot of good matchups for running backs, which is why, I think fading some of the more expensive options is a pretty good strategy. Joe Mixon going up against Chicago. Joe Mixon had a pretty big week one. But I'm just not crazy about Joe Mixon at $8,100. I don't expect him to repeat. I expect this to be CJ Stroud's week. But yeah, that's all I have for running back. So let's go ahead and take a look at receivers now. So your top receiver for the week, that's going to be Cooper Kupp going up against the Cardinals. Cooper Kupp under $8,000. They got him at $7,700. Going to be pretty high owned, even for a large slate like this. We got him at 36% ownership. We actually had him week one in a bunch of our lineups, and he ended up having a big week one, 110 yards and a touchdown. 21 targets. 21 targets. That's crazy. Obviously, with no Puka Nacua, he's going to continue to get a lot of targets with Stafford throwing him the ball. Stafford's in love with him. So I'm loving Cooper Kupp. He's actually the highest projected receiver, not just value guy of the slate. Then you got CeeDee Lamb. Not crazy about that matchup going up against New Orleans. $9,100 is extremely expensive when you could get other guys for a lot cheaper. People are telling me it's Amon Ra. I keep calling him Amon Ra. I guess I'm putting the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable. But Amon Ra, I'm saying it my way. Amon Ra at $9,000. Pretty expensive, not crazy about him, but he does have a pretty decent matchup against Tampa. So I will do some stacks with him and Jared Goff. Garrett Wilson, $8,100. It's pretty expensive, even though he has a pretty good matchup. I think there's a lot better options. Maybe I'll throw him into a stack with Aaron Rodgers, but I'm not going crazy with that. And I'm not crazy about Aaron Rodgers as a fantasy quarterback. Deebo Samuel, he's going to be getting a lot of carries out the backfield. Had a rushing touchdown last week. $7,300 is a pretty good price for him. We have him projected for 14.5 fantasy points. So I like his value going up against the Vikings, who are ranked 28th against opposing receivers. And actually, let's see what the Vikings are ranked against running backs. So it's going to be Jordan Mason. Okay, so they're actually decent against running backs. But still, I mean, he's going to be getting a lot of carries out the backfield. So that's pretty good value for him. I like Rashee Rice. I already said I like stacking him with Pat Mahomes. Going up against Cincinnati, ranked 19th. Rashee Rice had a pretty decent week one, 9 targets, 7 catches for 103 yards. So I'm liking Rashee Rice, and he might end up being a pretty good fantasy wide receiver. Justin Jefferson, I'm not crazy about that matchup, even though San Francisco says that they're ranked 23rd against opposing wide receivers. Still not crazy about that matchup. Not crazy about Sam Darnold throwing Justin Jefferson the ball. Justin Jefferson didn't do much besides that touchdown. If he didn't have that touchdown week one, he would have had a pretty yeah, you see 4 catches for 59 yards. Not a big game. So I'm not going to go with Justin Jefferson quite yet until I see some more out of him and Sam Darnold. Jamar Chase is another guy. I think they're in the same boat. Him and Joe Burrow. Not they're just not clicking right now for some reason. And a lot of people think it's Joe Burrow and has some, I think, what did they say, a wrist injury or something. So I'm not crazy about Jamar Chase at $8,700. That's really expensive. Uh, some of the Houston guys, I think they're worth stacking with CJ Stroud in a few lineups, doing some Nico Stroud lineups, some Diggs Stroud, or even Tank Dell and Stroud. I'm going to be doing some of that. Mike Evans, I'm going to be doing some, even though he's $8,000. I like his matchup, so I might be doing a few lineups with him and Baker, a few with Chris Godwin and Baker because Godwin's only $6,200. Um, Malik Neighbors, I need to see something from him. I mean, $6,400 is really cheap, but I got to see some, and he has a really good matchup going against Washington. But with Daniel Jones throwing him the ball, I need to see more before I start going with Malik Neighbors. Brandon Ayuk, he might be someone that you want to target. Maybe you exclude Debo Samuel and you lock in Brandon Ayuk. Maybe even do an Ayuk Brock Purdy stack at $7,000 because Brandon Ayuk, what did he have last week? He only had two receptions for 28 yards, but he was very close to having a touchdown. And he's, another week of practice under his belt with Brock Purdy, because he missed most of training camp. So now that he's getting a little bit more reps with Brock Purdy, he could end up, because remember, don't forget that Brandon Ayuk had a huge season last year. So maybe you consider doing him in a stack with Brock Purdy, but I'm not going too crazy with it. But he does have a pretty decent matchup. But yeah, those are all the guys I like. I mean, there are some low price guys who had pretty big week ones. And if you want to continue riding that success, maybe consider throwing them into a couple of lineups. One of those guys is Jameson Williams, had a huge week one, only $5,700. And what did he have week one? 9 targets, 5 catches for 121 yards and a tutty. And another guy who had a big week one was Jaden Reed. And obviously, I didn't start him in my fantasy league, even though I have him in both my leagues. 6 targets, 4 catches for 138 and a tutty. And then 1 carry for 33 yards and a tutty. Huge week one. I don't expect him to repeat again this week, especially with Malik Willis as his quarterback. So I don't know. I'm not going to get caught up in the Jaden Reed trap. But let's go ahead and take a look at tight ends now. Now, for tight ends, you got the big names with some pretty good matchups. You got Kelsey going up against the Bengals, ranked 31st against opposing tight ends. Sam Laporta going up against the Bucks, ranked 30th. And then Trey McBride going up against the Rams, ranked 29th against opposing tight ends. So these 3 guys have really good matchups. I like Travis Kelsey, actually. I like stacking him with Pat Mahomes, even though Kelsey hasn't really been doing, he hasn't been putting up Kelsey numbers recently. He is going up against the Bengals. There's a lot of history there. And, with last week wasn't a big week for tight ends. There was hardly any production from the tight end spot. So even if Kelsey gets you 11 points, he might end up being in the number 1 lineup. Same goes to all these guys, Laporta and Trey McBride. Not crazy about Kittle going up against the Vikings. Not a great matchup. Evan Ingram, if you want to throw him in as a sleeper pick, maybe you do that. But he is going against the Browns, who are ranked number 1 against opposing tight ends. And, I had Evan Ingram, and I had him in a lot of my lineups last week, and he produced a big fat dud. But I do expect them to be a little bit more deliberate and getting him the football this week. And at under $6,000, he might be kind of like a sleeper play. Now, you got Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. I might do one of each. I might do 1 or 2 lineups with Mark Andrews and 1 or 2 lineups with Isaiah Likely because Lamar Jackson loves throwing to his tight ends. Last week, they really keyed in on Mark Andrews, and I left Isaiah Likely open a ton. So I think if I had to guess, it's going to be the other way around this week. I think they're really going to key in on Isaiah Likely, and I think Mark Andrews might actually end up having a pretty decent game. So out of the 2, if I had to pick which one's going to have the bigger game, I think it's going to be Mark Andrews. But yeah, those are really all the tight ends that I like. Let's go ahead and take a look at defense now. Now, for defense, there's some really good matchups. All these matchups right here are really good matchups, but they're all going to cost you $4,000 or up. You got the Texans going up against Caleb Williams, who didn't really look the greatest last week, even though he got the win. You got the Colts going up against Malik Willis. Niners going up against the Vikings. I mean, these are great matchups, but they're going to cost you. If you want to save some money, though, with defense, you might want to consider going with, you got the Jaguars going against Cleveland, who does not look really good right now, or the Broncos going up against Pittsburgh. Those are some lower price options that you might want to consider if you want to save a little money on some of these top defenses. But yeah, those are pretty much all of the positions. Now I'm going to go over some stacks that I like for week 2. All right, so before I show you some of the strategies and stacks that I was working on, let's go ahead and just run the top lineup just to see what it spits out. Okay, so it's picking up Stroud, picking up all those receivers that I mentioned earlier that I like: Debo, Cooper, Rasheed Rice. It's picking up Evan Ingram again, even though he has a bad matchup. He's only $5,900. Might want to fade him there. And then it's picking up the Broncos defense, which I mentioned earlier as being a pretty decent matchup at $3,400. So James Conner, $6,500. He had a pretty big week one. Brees Hall. But yeah, so it's not organically picking up a stack. So let's go ahead and let's close this and let's come over here to rules and then let's just do check this box right here. Always include a quarterback and one receiver from the same team. And this is just going to make sure that it picks up the top stack. I want to see what it spits out. Okay, so it's doing Mahomes and Rasheed Rice. So yeah, that's the top stack. But yeah, so basically, if I wanted to save this as a strategy, I would just come over here and save this, and I'll just call this top stack. And it's basically all the settings that you put into the optimizer. It's going to save it to your draft time profile. That way you can access it later. But I already did that. I already have it here under the strategies tab. So I'm not going to do that in this video. But I'm going to go to the strategies tab and show you some of the strategies that I was working on. So basically, you just got the default top 5. That's no settings on the optimizer, top 5. Then you got Pat Mahomes and Rasheed Rice, which actually ended up being the top default stack. I got 2 lineups like that. I got Mahomes and Kelsey. But actually, now that I think of it, I'll need to redo this strategy. I'll need to also make sure I exclude Rasheed Rice because I don't want to pick up both Kelsey and Rasheed Rice. So I'll make sure I do that. Then you got Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews. Lamar Jackson, Isaiah Likely. I do think at least one of those guys is going to have a big game. I think it's going to be Mark Andrews this week, but who knows? Then you got CJ and Nico. So I made sure I did a stack with those 2 guys. And I also made sure that I was excluding Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell. Then another one with CJ and Stephon. And I made sure that I excluded Tank Dell and Nico Collins. Then I did Stafford and Cooper Kupp. They have a pretty good matchup. 3 lineups like that. I did Jared Goff and Amon-Ra. Made sure I excluded Sam Laporta. But then I did another one with Jared Goff and Laporta. Made sure I excluded Amon-Ra. Then I did a double stack with Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans. They have a pretty good matchup this week. But I want to check something. I want to make sure that Mike Evans and Chris Godwin are not negatively correlated. So let's come over here to the player pool. And I forgot to show you guys this feature last week, but this is a new feature that we implemented. Let's take a look at Tampa. So if you come over here and you click on Mike Evans' name and come to this correlation tab, we could choose as player B, we could choose Chris Godwin. And now it's telling us that they're actually negatively correlated. So Mike Evans' average this season and last season was 14.64. But when Chris Godwin played above Chris Godwin's average, Mike Evans' average dropped down to 12.96. But then when Chris Godwin played below average, Mike Evans' average shot up to 15.72. So that means they're negatively correlated. So this is a new feature that we have. I encourage you guys to take advantage of it. Maybe your lineup is picking up a receiver and a running back from the same team, and maybe you want to see if they're positively or negatively correlated. Like, let's say it was picking up Rachaad White and Mike Evans. Well, if you come over here to Rachaad White and Mike Evans, okay, you see they're actually positively correlated. So, maybe you keep them both together in the same lineup. This is also going to be available for the NBA. It's a really good feature for the NBA. Maybe your NBA lineup is picking up Jamal Murray and Jokic, and you want to make sure that they're positively correlated before you have them in the same lineup. And with those two guys in particular, I think they are positively correlated, but that's besides the point. But yeah, so let's come back here to strategies. So yeah, we got the Bucks double stack. I'm not gonna go too crazy with that because, like I said, they're Mike Evans and Godwin are negatively correlated, and you don't really need to go with a double stack in a pretty big slate like this one in a 13-game slate. I might consider just removing this strategy altogether. But then I have these. I have Baker and Chris Godwin with no Mike Evans, and I have one with Baker, Mayfield, and Mike Evans, and I made sure I excluded Chris Godwin. But yeah, then I have my cash lineup, which is the same as last week, where I put 100% weight on my PRJ2 projections, which are our cash projections. And then I have this GPP lineup where I put 100% weight on PRJ1, which are the ownership adjusted projections for GPP tournaments. And then I made sure for that one, I also checked the rule box. I said always include a quarterback and one receiver for the same team. So yeah, if you come over here to save lineups, I basically ran all those lineups and saved them. And then I applied those to all of my entries. The cash lineup, I applied to 3 of my 50-50s. And then my other 50-50s are just going with the default number 1 lineup. And then I got this $15 Sunday Million, bunch of entries for those. Just kind of going with, I went with the default top 2, went with the Mahomes stack, went with the GPP lineup. And then I did 3 lineups with Stafford and Kupp because, like I said, I really like a Stafford Kupp stack this week. Even though Kupp is going to be pretty high owned, I don't expect Matt Stafford to be that high owned. Then I got the Bucks double stack here. But like I mentioned earlier, you got Godwin and Mike Evans who are negatively correlated. So I might just end up taking that out and replacing that. And then with the $3 tournament, this is the $3 tournament with guaranteed overlay, $50,000 in first place. For this one, I pretty much did all those other lineups that I mentioned earlier. And if you come over here to view exposure, I got 100% exposure to Cooper Kupp, Jordan Mason, and Brees Hall. So with these remaining entries here, I think I'm going to exclude some of those guys just so I don't have a full 100% exposure to those guys. The guy that I'm probably going to exclude the most is going to be Brees Hall because I don't like Brees Hall's price. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have for week 2. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're not already subscribed, head over to drafttime.com, sign up for a 7-day trial before I close out the trial window. And today's actually Thursday. I forgot to mention. So we got the Dolphins-Bills game tonight. I got the single game slate up for that, so you guys could go ahead and run that. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have. So good luck to everyone.